The air in the conference room felt unnaturally sterile, filtered not just through vents but through decades of exclusion. Zaria Monroe sat on the far side of the long walnut table, her pressed navy blazer too stiff against her skin, and her hands folded tightly in her lap, shaking only slightly, though her heart thudded against her ribs like a trapped drumline. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. She had walked in with more than a resume. She had walked in with a legacy. A Harvard MBA, top of her class, 3 startup turnarounds under her belt, a strategic mind honed by nights spent dissecting pitch decks, not for applause but for survival. But in that room, none of it mattered. 12 chairs encircled the table. 11 of them were occupied by white men in bespoke suits and watches that cost more than her car. The 12th, at the head, belonged to Grayson Whitmore, the investor whose nod could turn ideas into empires or erase them before they ever touched soil. Zaria had rehearsed every word of her presentation. She had even memorized each slide's data points in reverse order. She didn't come seeking validation, just opportunity. She spoke crisp and clear, laying out her fintech platform that centered financial literacy for underserved Black communities. The room gave nothing back, no nods, no questions, just tight mouths and sideways glances, as though she'd walked into the wrong building. Grayson didn't even pretend to read her resume. His fingers picked up the crisp, cream-colored paper with her name embossed at the top, held it for 2 seconds, then let it drop into the trash bin beside him. The thud of the paper hitting plastic sounded louder than her entire pitch. Zaria's voice stalled mid-sentence. A pause, one that hung like a noose in the room. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "We're not currently interested in anything that niche," he said, drawing out the last word like it was a contaminant. "We're focused on more scalable innovation. No eye contact. No thank you. Just dismissal, casual and complete." Zaria's skin burned, not from embarrassment, but from the calculated performance of indifference. She looked around. Not a single face shifted. They all watched her like a museum exhibit, contained, observed, then forgotten. The silence didn't ask her to leave. It didn't need to. It had already pushed her out the door. Zaria stood, carefully, the way one does when they're trying to keep glass from falling out of their chest. She collected her bag, her dignity. The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed down the hallway, too loud and too hollow. Outside, the wind slapped against her face, but it couldn't cool the fire pulsing beneath her skin. She walked past the revolving doors, past the valet line, past the SUV with tinted windows that had dropped her off with hope just an hour ago. Her phone buzzed in her purse, probably her sister or her mentor Dr. Elaine checking in, but she couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, the scream inside might swallow her whole. Zaria didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because tears would have felt like surrender. And she had learned long ago that Black women didn't get to show wounds. They were expected to bleed invisibly and still show up polished. She had spent years tailoring her voice to be palatable, her wardrobe to be neutral, her tone to be calm in the face of provocation. She thought credentials would shield her. She thought excellence would open doors. But she wasn't just rejected. She was erased, discarded in the same way her resume was. Unread, unconsidered, unworthy. She found herself walking without aim, past rows of glass buildings that sparkled like promises she'd never be allowed to touch. Every corner whispered stories of men who had done less and gotten more. And yet she had spent every ounce of her 20s collecting achievements like armor, only to realize the war didn't care how well armed she was. A flash of memory hit her. Her mother braiding her hair, before her first debate tournament in high school. "Make them listen," she had said, "even if they try not to see you." Zaria had done more than make them listen. She had spoken in rooms she was never invited to. She had built bridges from broken sidewalks, and still, it wasn't enough. The humiliation clung to her like wet fabric. Not just because of the rejection, but because she knew that if her name had been Elizabeth, or Catherine, or Olivia, someone in that room would have leaned forward, would have asked a question, would have at least skimmed the page before tossing it into the trash. She stopped walking, looked up. The bakery across the street was boarded up. Faded paint on the awning still read Monroe's, her grandmother's shop. The place where she had learned about compound interest by watching sugar and butter turn into rent money. It had been empty for years, forgotten, just like her in that boardroom. A flicker of something stirred in her chest. Rage, yes, but also memory. She didn't head home. She crossed the street. The alley beside the bakery reeked of rust and mildew. She found the old key still taped behind the busted utility box. It slipped into the lock with resistance, but then gave way. The door creaked open, and air thick with dust and nostalgia greeted her. Inside, the counters were covered in cobwebs, and the wallpaper peeled like tired skin. But the bones of the place were still strong. She stepped into the middle of the floor, surrounded by ghosts of childhood afternoons, cinnamon rolls, and her grandmother's humming. Zaria knelt down and touched the floorboards. There, underneath the third tile near the register, was the metal box her grandmother had always told her to remember. She pried it open. Inside, faded deeds, handwritten notes, tax records from a time when black business ownership was a radical act of survival. She traced her fingers over the signature. Josephine Monroe, 19. The room spun, not with dizziness, but with possibility. The kind that smells like sugar, ink, and a second chance. She wasn't going home. Zaria was about to resurrect something. And she wasn't asking for permission. Underneath those dusty deeds was another name on a property map, one she hadn't expected to see. Grayson Whitmore. Zaria stood motionless in the hollow belly of the old bakery, holding the brittle paper map like it was a scalpel pressed to her skin. Grayson Whitmore. His name had been scribbled beside one of the boundary lines near the edge of the Monroe property, inked in the same faded pen strokes her grandmother had used for her signature. It didn't make sense, not yet, but something inside her began to unravel. And that unraveling wasn't quiet. It roared. By the time she stumbled back into her apartment, bare walls, thrifted furniture, laptop still glowing from a week-old pitch rehearsal, the rage had found its shape. It wasn't fiery, it was cold, dense, like steel forged under pressure. She dropped her purse and stood in front of the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, still in the navy blazer she had worn into that boardroom, still with makeup smudged by wind and time, still holding the phantom weight of her resume, now rotting at the bottom of a trash bin she didn't own. Her jaw clenched. Not because of rejection. She'd been rejected before. This was something deeper, something uglier, the kind of hurt that wraps around your ribcage and squeezes, whispering that no matter how hard you work, how clean you speak, how polished your pitch is, you will always be seen as less. She pressed both palms against the mirror, forehead touching cool glass. I did everything right, she whispered to herself, voice cracking in the quiet room, and they still didn't see me. But she wasn't just mourning her pitch. She was mourning the lie she'd been fed her entire life. From the time she was a little girl growing up on the edges of Atlanta, her mother had told her, work twice as hard, be twice as smart, keep your head down and your chin up. It had been a family motto, passed down like scripture. Zaria had believed it with a child's faith. Every spelling bee trophy, every honor roll, every sleepless night at Harvard, each one a desperate step up a ladder, she was told would eventually let her into the room. But in that room, she wasn't a candidate. She was a silhouette, a statistic. Her reflection flickered just for a second, and her mind pulled her backward. Flashback, age 9. Zaria was sitting on her grandmother's lap, reading from a worn-out copy of Black Enterprise magazine. Josephine Monroe pointed to a photo of a black woman in a sharp suit. She had to fight 3 times as hard just to stand where a white man already stood. But she stood anyway, her grandmother had said. Back then, Zaria didn't understand the weight behind those words. She had just liked the woman's shoes. Another flash. High school. Her advanced placement economics teacher, Mr. Halbridge, handed back tests. He smiled at every student until he reached her. Nice job, Zaria, he muttered, like it hurt him to say. She had scored the highest, but when the school recommended students for a business camp scholarship, her name wasn't on the list. Her mother had stormed into the principal's office. They called it an oversight. By college, the microaggressions had become so familiar she could catalog them. The surprise when she spoke so well. The way security guards always followed her through stores near campus. The emails that opened with Dear Mr. Monroe, even though her resume included a professional headshot. The racism wasn't loud. It wasn't burning crosses and slurs in alleys. It was subtler, more sinister. It was locked doors, thin smiles, and unreturned emails. It was her pitch being labeled niche. It was her name being skipped in lineups. It was having to code switch so much that she barely recognized her own voice anymore. Zaria sank to the floor, knees folding like paper under the weight of everything she had carried for decades. The apartment was still, save for the soft hum of traffic beyond the window. She was alone, but the ghosts of every insult, every doubt, every backhanded compliment were screaming in her ears. Rejection hurts, she murmured, voice hollow. But racism? It scars. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Instead, she pulled out her laptop, opened the folder labeled Career Arsenal. Inside were 37 versions of her resume. tailored for different investors, firms, and opportunities. Each one a variation of the same exhausting dance, trying to prove, trying to earn, trying to belong. She scrolled through them slowly, eyes dry and burning. Every file was a timestamp on her belief that the system would reward her if she just worked hard enough. But she had played by their rules. She had spoken in their tone. She had shrunk herself into digestible forms. And still, she had been discarded. She opened the most recent file, read it one last time. She noticed how even her language had softened her truth. Experience leading DEI initiatives in multicultural settings instead of pioneered racial equity programs that were met with resistance and threats. She looked at her name, bold and centered at the top, Zaria Monroe. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She dragged the file to the trash. Then the next one. Then the next. One by one, she erased them. Not out of despair, but out of refusal. Refusal to keep shaping herself to be acceptable in a world that had already decided she was invisible. By the time the folder was empty, her breathing had calmed. Not because the pain was gone, but because clarity had begun to settle in its place. She wasn't going to beg for seats at tables anymore. She was going to build a table so big and so solid, no one could pretend not to see it. She stared at the empty folder on her screen. Her finger hovered over the trackpad for a moment longer, before she clicked empty trash. Her past, her performance, her perfectionism gone. Her new life wouldn't start with a resume. It would start with a reckoning. Just as she closes her laptop, her phone buzzes. A notification from a county land surveyor's database she had forgotten she subscribed to. The alert: new claim filed under Monroe Heritage District. The name on the claimant: Whitmore Capital Holdings. The alert glowed on her phone screen like a ghost clawing back from the grave. New claim filed under Monroe Heritage District. Claimant Whitmore Capital Holdings. Zaria blinked at the words, unable to look away. The name burned in her chest like gasoline meeting flame. Whitmore Capital Holdings. Grayson's empire. The same man who had thrown her resume in the trash without blinking. The same man who now had his hands somehow in her family's district. Her family's story. She didn't wait for sunrise. Still wearing the same navy blazer. Still wearing yesterday's exhaustion like a second skin. She grabbed her keys, shoved the old property map and her phone into her tote bag, and headed back to the one place where it all began. The place she had avoided for years because it felt too heavy, too hollow, too full of ghosts. The bakery. It stood like a silent relic on the corner of Jackson and Lenox, its once sunlit windows now grimy, its green awning sagging with the weight of time. The sign still read Monroe's, faded but defiant, even as the world around it gentrified into cold brew cafes and yoga studios with glass fronts and zero history. She parked half a block away and walked the rest of the distance. Her steps slowed as she neared the door. It wasn't locked. She had never rekeyed it after her grandmother passed. The hinges cried as the door opened, the same way they had when Zaria was a child and her grandmother would come down at dawn to bake. Inside, everything smelled like dust and memories. Flour still clung to the old mixer in the corner, frozen in time. The air was dry and stale, but she could almost hear her grandmother's hum weaving between the shadows. She moved slowly, reverently, like she was walking through sacred land. Zaria paused in front of the register, where she remembered standing on a milk crate as a little girl, ringing up customers on Saturdays. Her grandmother had always worn the same apron, always greeted people with a warmth that no one could fake. "This place ain't just for bread," she used to say. "It's for roots." Her fingers brushed across the counter. The marble was chipped, the wood beneath beginning to rot. But there was strength still hidden in its bones, like the kind her grandmother had. She knelt by the register, removed the loose floorboard beneath, and pulled out the metal box she'd rediscovered days before. But this time, she didn't just glance. She opened every folder, read every paper. Buried under old invoices and savings ledgers, wrapped in parchment and sealed with wax, was a document she had never seen before. A handwritten will, notarized, signed in Josephine Monroe's long, looping cursive. The language was clear. "I hereby leave full claim and ownership of 1427 Jackson Ave and all adjacent Monroe property lines to my granddaughter Zaria Elise Monroe upon her 25th birthday." Zaria's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't turned 25 yet when Josephine died. And no one, no attorney, no court clerk had ever mentioned this will. In fact, the probate court had declared the estate incomplete, stating no legal ownership could be determined. But this document was real. Stamped, dated, valid. She leaned back against the wall, clutching it, mind racing. Her grandmother had made her the rightful owner. But someone had buried that truth. Or worse, taken it. Her eyes scanned the documents again. Tucked into the back was a map of Monroe District, an old one, scribbled in colored pencil and highlighter. It outlined more than just the bakery. Her grandmother had invested in other lots, a small barber shop, a parking lot, even a vacant corner building that had once been a jazz club. The deeds weren't just dusty, they were powerful. And some of them had names penciled in beside Monroe's, names she didn't recognize at first. Until she got to one, right near the edge of the block, written in newer ink. Whitmore Cap, pending claim. Zaria stared at it. The map had to be 20 years old, which meant Whitmore's firm had been sniffing around this area for a long time. Long before the gentrification, long before the city started rezoning black districts for redevelopment. It wasn't random, it was strategic, predatory. Suddenly, things made sense in a way that made her skin crawl. The rejection, the condescension, the arrogance. Grayson hadn't seen her as just another pitch. He had seen her name. He had heard Monroe and connected it to something else, something buried under decades of land schemes, redevelopment bids, and quiet buyouts. Maybe that's why he hadn't needed to read her resume. Maybe he already knew who she was and what he had taken from her. Zaria stood up slowly. Rage and grief tangled in her spine. Her grandmother's district wasn't just under threat. It had been under attack. Quiet, legal, calculated. She walked to the back of the bakery. The kitchen was still intact, at least structurally. And in that moment she could almost smell cinnamon, see the dough rising, hear the laughter of customers on Saturday mornings. This wasn't just brick and mortar. It was legacy. And they had tried to erase it. Just like they tried to erase her. But not anymore. Not when the blueprints were right here. Not when her name was on every line that mattered. She took out her phone, opened the land database again, and searched for Whitmore Capital Holdings. It wasn't just one property. They had already filed soft claims for 5 lots in Monroe District. Some marked as pending acquisition, others labeled city-backed redevelopment candidates. Zaria gripped the edge of the metal counter, heart pounding. It wasn't just about her grandmother anymore. It was about everyone who had built something here and been quietly pushed out. This wasn't just theft. It was erasure with paperwork. Her hands trembled, but her resolve hardened. She was going to fight. Not for a second chance, but for everything they never thought she could reclaim. Sometimes the past leaves behind blueprints for the future, hidden in pain. As she scans through another envelope buried deep in the metal box, her eyes catch a faded, creased photo. Grayson Whitmore as a young man, standing beside a city council member with the caption, "Redevelopment Visionaries of South Atlanta." Behind them, a large printed blueprint of Monroe District. The photo of Grayson Whitmore, young, smirking beside a councilman with a map of Monroe District behind them, clung to Zaria's consciousness like a scar. He hadn't just rejected her. He had studied her family's land before she ever knew she had a claim to it. This wasn't business. This was systemic conquest disguised as redevelopment. But this time she had the map. She had the deed. And now she needed the weapons. She didn't know how to fight land sharks or maneuver zoning boards. She didn't understand the cryptic language of escrow, title insurance, or LLC structures designed to conceal true buyers. But she was about to learn. The next morning, while most of the city stirred with routines, Zaria was already deep in an online rabbit hole, registering for a real estate crash course taught through a nonprofit that supported minority entrepreneurs. It wasn't glossy or corporate. The Zoom sessions were filled with everyday people, barbers, single moms, retirees. But what they lacked in polish, they made up for in urgency. Everyone in that virtual room was fighting for a piece of land before it disappeared. Zaria took notes like her life depended on it. Because it did. The terms hit like a foreign language at first. 1031 exchanges, quiet titles, leverage equity. But by week 2, she could recite case law precedents faster than she ever had at Harvard. This wasn't academia. This was war disguised as paperwork. Her notebook filled fast, not just with definitions, but with questions, big ones. Why were certain neighborhoods upzoned only after black families were priced out?
Why did banks always approve white developers faster even with weaker financials?
Why were black women approved for business loans at half the national rate? The answers weren't in textbooks. They were in the lived experiences of her classmates. People who had been denied permits for reasons that didn't exist, offered buyouts below market value, told their businesses didn't fit the new image. Zaria listened, and every story became a thread she wove into a larger tapestry, one of resistance. Then came the fieldwork. She began shadowing site visits, sitting in on city planning commission meetings, lurking at public auctions, and walking properties with other first-time buyers. These weren't classrooms. They were battlegrounds, dressed in khakis and fake smiles. In her first in-person development meeting at a downtown community forum, she raised her hand to ask about inclusionary zoning and tax abatements for legacy black-owned businesses. The white male moderator skimmed past her question. Later, another attendee, a white woman in expensive heels, leaned over and whispered with a tight-lipped smile, "You're really passionate, huh? Are you a community activist or just like starting out?" Zariah blinked slowly. "I'm building an investment group." The woman gave a soft chuckle, as if Zariah had said she was planning to buy Mars. But Zariah didn't flinch. She started wearing less makeup. Not out of laziness, but because it kept people guessing. She spoke less in meetings and asked more questions, sharp ones, surgical ones. She realized that silence made people uncomfortable when they couldn't place you. At one point, she met with a junior bank officer about opening a business account. When she handed over her documents, Harvard credentials, proof of inheritance, projected development costs, the officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a partner who'll be managing the financials?" he asked. "No," she said flatly. He smiled, like he was doing her a favor. "I mean someone with experience." Zariah leaned forward. "I've managed capital for 3 startups. One exited at 2.3x valuation. The only thing I'm inexperienced with is explaining my qualifications twice." His smile dropped. It wasn't just the banks. It was the brokers too. She called 5 real estate agents before one agreed to meet. Even then, the woman barely looked at her during their walkthrough, referring to investors like you in a tone that was barely civil. But Zariah kept walking. She kept learning, kept collecting every rejection like a brick for the foundation she was building. By month 2, she had filed for 2 LLCs, each under neutral, gender-ambiguous names. She used them to make inquiries about distressed properties near Monroe District. The tone changed fast. When she was anonymous, brokers responded faster. When they didn't see her face, banks offered longer calls. It confirmed what she already knew. The system didn't hate in public anymore. It discriminated through delay. She found her rhythm in the spaces where rules were designed to be gates. And slowly, she learned how to unlock them. Her first real breakthrough came during a community redevelopment auction hosted at a downtown hotel. Most of the bidders were older white men in pastel button-downs. Zariah showed up in a tan pantsuit with her hair braided back, carrying a laptop, a folder, and no expectations. The auction moved fast, too fast. And just as she was about to back out, a lot came up. A single parcel 1 block from the bakery, zoned commercial, neglected for years. Opening bid $4,000. She tapped her notepad. It matched a corner lot her grandmother had once circled in pencil. A key access point. She raised her hand, quietly, firmly. A few heads turned. One of the older bidders whispered, "She must be new." She didn't blink. Within 2 minutes, she won the bid. It wasn't a building. Not yet. But it was land. Her land. She walked out into the night air afterward and sat in her car, hands shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. They said she didn't belong in their boardrooms, so she learned how to buy them. She was just getting started. But there was still one hurdle: funding. Zariah spent 3 weeks building a rock-solid proposal. Not for investors, but for herself. She presented her plan to 3 community credit unions, 2 fintech startups, and a local black banking collective. She was rejected 4 times. But on the 5th, she got an email. Subject: pre-approval confirmed. Amount $175,000. Terms: 3.2% over 15 years. Commercial development credit line. Secured under LLC 278, Monroe Legacy Revitalization Project. She stared at the screen for 10 full seconds, heart pounding in her chest like a drum against silence. Her hands hovered above her keyboard, unsure whether to cry or scream or laugh. She had done it. No partners, no diluted shares. Just her, and her name. As she scrolled through the loan documents, a small line caught her eye. Originating lender, Whitmore Community Development Fund, subsidiary of Whitmore Capital Holdings. Her jaw tightened. She wasn't just getting into the game. She was already playing on his board. The words Whitmore Community Development Fund blinked on Zariah's screen like a curse she couldn't unspeak. Her first approved loan, her first official step into the game, was tied to the same empire that had once erased her with a flick of the wrist. She stared at the document, the room around her still as stone. Part of her wanted to tear it up, walk away, find another path. But walking away meant giving him power again. It meant silence. And she was done being silent, at least in spirit. So she made a decision. If the system was built to see her color first, then she'd make herself invisible. Zaria created 2 new LLCs within a week. The first, Northward Equity Group, a name vague enough to suggest suburban investors. The second, Cypress Ladder Holdings, intentionally curated to evoke images of old wealth and bland trust. Neither had her name anywhere. She opened a separate mailing address under one, hired a white mail broker to field initial inquiries for both, not because she wanted to, because she had to. And suddenly, the resistance softened. Phone calls were returned within hours instead of weeks. Brokers answered questions with enthusiasm, not caution. One even emailed to say, "It's good to see more established firms interested in revitalizing South Atlanta. We've had less predictable interest lately." Zaria didn't respond, but her chest burned. She knew what less predictable meant. In less than 30 days, she secured 2 properties, a boarded-up duplex, and an old auto shop within walking distance of the bakery. Both were neglected, underpriced, and sitting on rezoned land that would be gold in 5 years. Whitmore's people had overlooked them, too small, too local, perfect for her. But it wasn't just about the purchase. She showed up to the duplex in jeans and a hoodie, clipboard in hand, posing as a project assistant. The current tenant, an elderly black man named Mr. Langston, eyed her with suspicion. "You from the city?" he asked, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. "No, sir. I'm from here," she said softly. "And I'm not here to move you out. I want to know what you need." Mr. Langston studied her for a long time before slowly pulling a folding chair from the porch. "Come sit then." That first conversation turned into 6 weeks of dialogue. Zaria helped him access overdue repairs through a community home improvement grant. She connected with his neighbors, barbers, grandmothers, single moms, all living on land being swallowed piece by piece. They didn't trust easily. But Zaria didn't speak like a developer. She listened like kin. Word spread quietly. People who had ignored her in meetings now whispered names and properties at church gatherings, nail salons, neighborhood cookouts. Zaria wasn't just building a portfolio. She was building trust. And with every handshake, every nod, every coffee shared in plastic cups on porches, her plan grew sharper. She mapped out the Monroe Heritage Grid by hand, layering her grandmother's original plots with new parcels being scooped up by outside firms. Patterns emerged, clusters being targeted, sections being ignored. She focused on the ignored. Because in real estate, power doesn't begin with the big buildings. It begins with what people overlook. By the end of that quarter, Cypress Ladder Holdings had acquired 3 parcels, all tied to local families she gave the option to remain tenants. One of them, the widow of a jazz musician, cried in her arms when Zaria showed her the lease terms. "They always come in smiling, and then they bulldoze you," she said. "But you feel like my own blood." Zaria's throat tightened. "That's because I am." Still, she moved quietly. Her own name never showed on paperwork. She avoided press, PR, anything that smelled like ego. Every deal was executed through proxies and digital layers. Silence, she learned, was its own kind of power. But nothing stayed hidden forever. One morning, while reviewing property leads through her LLC inbox, she noticed an email flagged for urgency. Subject: acquisition offer. Parcel cluster 24B. She opened it cautiously. It was a formal letter of interest addressed to Cypress Ladder Holdings, her LLC, requesting a private bid offer for a commercial block of 5 lots bordering the Monroe district. The sender? Her breath caught. She read the email 3 times, then a 4th. Grayson's firm was offering to sell, and not just any property, his commercial block. The one adjacent to the land she now quietly owned. The one that had served as the entry point for his redevelopment initiative. The one she'd been told was untouchable. Zaria leaned back slowly, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. Had he figured her out? Was this a test? Or had Whitmore simply misread her silence as inexperience? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. He had underestimated her again. But this time, she wasn't walking into a boardroom with a resume. She was walking in with leverage. When the system is built to see your color first, learn to move without being seen. She picks up her phone to call her attorney, but before she can dial, a notification lights up. A newly listed property at the heart of Monroe District just hit the market for immediate auction. The listing agent? Whitmore's legal counsel. Zaria stared at the newly listed property like it was a message encoded in fire. Lot number 76. Heart of Monroe District. Immediate auction. Seller Whitmore Legal. The very center of her grandmother's legacy. The pulse of everything her family once touched, now dangling in a marketplace like a forgotten heirloom up for grabs. She didn't call her attorney. She didn't speak. She moved. Within 24 hours, she submitted a letter of intent to purchase through Cypress Ladder Holdings. Strategically vague, legally sound, cloaked in the language of cautious professional interest. No names, no photos, no traces. The silence that followed was almost spiritual. Like the city itself had paused, breath held, waiting. 3 days later, an email landed. Your firm has been shortlisted for final negotiations on the Monroe cluster. Please be prepared to present proof of funds, development intent, and long-term capital projections. Negotiations will be handled directly through the seller's office. Zaria sat at her kitchen table. The world hushed around her. The apartment was dark, lit only by her laptop screen. But inside her chest was a storm she couldn't contain. She was going back into his house, not with a folder full of dreams, but with a check big enough to buy his arrogance brick by brick. The irony made her breath catch. The same building where she had been humiliated, reduced to nothing by a dismissive glance and a casual toss of paper, was now within her grasp. She wasn't just buying land. She was reclaiming dignity. The next morning she dressed not for war, but for clarity. A loose gray suit, natural curls tied back in a low twist, no makeup, no jewelry, just eyes sharpened by memory and a silence that could slice through marble. Her broker, a white woman named Dana, she'd hired for the optics of legitimacy, accompanied her. Dana had no idea who Zaria really was. She simply knew her client moved through deals with precision, never once hesitating on terms or backing down from pushback. The Whitmore Building's lobby hadn't changed. Still glinting with wealth, still silent with pretense. Zaria felt it like a bruise under her skin. The meeting room was on the 11th floor, frosted glass, minimalist decor. 3 white men sat at the table. Grayson Whitmore wasn't among them. But his scent was everywhere, power masquerading as professionalism. Dana introduced herself first. Cypress Ladder Holdings is honored to be among the final bidders. We believe this district holds tremendous long-term value. The men nodded. Zaria remained quiet. She watched the room, the tempo of the dialogue, the hesitation in one man's voice when Dana mentioned community integration and preserving cultural footprints. He shifted in his chair, masking discomfort with a shallow sip of water. This is a numbers play, he said. Our client's willing to entertain offers in the $2.1 to $2 million range. Property taxes have ballooned, and he's looking to liquidate quickly. Zaria's pulse slowed, so they were vulnerable. Whitmore was bleeding cash. That explained the fire sale listing. Dana offered a polite smile. We're prepared to submit a written offer today, but only under strict confidentiality clauses. Cypress Ladder doesn't engage in publicized transactions. The men agreed, eager, unaware. Back in the car, Dana turned to Zaria. You want me to draft the purchase agreement now? Zaria nodded, and ask for access to the zoning records immediately. Dana hesitated. You're really going after this one, huh? Zaria looked out the window, the reflection of her own face staring back. I've waited a long time to own something they told me I couldn't touch. That night, as she reviewed the architectural blueprints of the building, she found herself tracing the outline of the very conference room she had once stood in. Nervous, hopeful, desperate to be seen. She could still feel the burn of Whitmore's indifference. She would own that room now, and the land beneath it. But the emotional weight didn't lift with the paperwork. She thought of her grandmother again, Josephine Monroe, who had fought quietly in a world louder than hers, who had paid off property taxes 2 months late because banks wouldn't give her a line of credit, who'd stayed open on holidays so she could save for repairs the city refused to help with. She had laid the bricks of Monroe District with calloused hands and a quiet kind of genius. And Zaria was about to buy back what had been stolen from her. 2 days later, the offer was submitted. $2.115 million, all cash. Contingent on a 30-day inspection window, a strict NDA, and first rights to adjacent parcels if they hit the market. It was bold, surgical, and enough to shake the board. The next email didn't come from the negotiation team. It came from Grayson Whitmore himself. Offer accepted. Let's meet. Zaria stared at the screen, heat crawling up her neck. Her fingers curled into fists at her side. He didn't know. Not yet. He had no idea the woman behind Cypress Ladder Holdings was the same black woman he had dismissed without a glance. The same woman whose resume he had tossed in the trash like a coffee receipt. But soon, he would. She wasn't just buying land. She was reclaiming dignity. As she prepares for the final meeting with Whitmore, her phone pings with an alert. Incoming legal notice. Petition to freeze assets linked to Monroe District Holdings. Filed anonymously. Timed perfectly. A final roadblock. And possibly a trap. The notification pulsed on her screen like a nerve set on fire. Incoming legal notice. Petition to freeze assets linked to Monroe District Holdings. Zarya stared at the subject line, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, breath shallow. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was precision, weaponized timing. The petition had no signature, anonymous, strategically filed under a shell entity with a post office box in Delaware, but Zarya knew exactly who was behind it. Grayson. He had accepted her offer. But now he was trying to trap her. Delay her. Crack the mask before the deal closed. She forwarded the notice to her attorney with 2 words, handle quietly. Then she stood, adjusted her jacket, and slid the property inspection folder into her leather briefcase. She was still moving forward. The building was hers now, at least in process. Every signature, every document, every number had passed. And if Whitmore wanted to test her, if he wanted to throw a shadow just before the light came in, then so be it. Let him. She would walk through the front door anyway. The car ride to the property was silent. She didn't play music. She didn't speak to Dana, who sat beside her with a clipboard of inspection details and a list of zoning compliance items. But her mind was loud. The building rose like a monument of irony in the center of the block, a glass and stone structure, 5 stories high, polished to reflect the city's ambition, but none of its struggle. Zarya had once stood outside those doors, wearing a fitted blazer, hope stitched into every seam, her resume a manifesto of excellence. That day they hadn't seen a future partner. They had seen a black woman out of place. Now she stood at the same threshold with keys in her bag and ownership at her back. And still, she paused. Because trauma doesn't leave just because the title deed says you're in control. It lingers. It echoes. It haunts. She pressed her hand to the cool metal of the door handle. And pushed. The lobby was the same. Marble floors, gold accents, white walls washed in soft lighting. It smelled of expensive air, filtered, corporate, untouched by sweat or struggle. Only this time, something had shifted. Zarya didn't flinch. Dana stepped forward and spoke to the security desk. We're here for the buyer's final inspection. Cypress Ladder Holdings. The guard, young, pale, alert, glanced at his screen, nodded, and handed over temporary access badges. His tone was brisk, efficient. Zarya saw no recognition in his face. But she remembered him. He was the same man who had asked her to stand to the side years ago while everyone else was ushered through. She took the badge from his hand without a word. The elevator ride up to the 3rd floor felt like being carried into her own past. The doors opened. The same hallway, same carpeting, same silence. And at the end, the same glass reception desk. This time, the woman behind it was sipping from a paper coffee cup, scrolling through her phone, eyes glazed with disinterest. Her blonde hair was pinned high in a messy bun, and her fingers tapped the screen like she was fighting boredom. Zarya approached quietly. The woman looked up with a mechanical smile. Hi, do you have an appointment? Zarya paused. Let the moment hang. She wasn't going to say her name. She didn't need to. Dana stepped in again. We're here from Cypress Ladder Holdings for the buyer inspection. Documents were filed last week. The receptionist's expression didn't change. She barely nodded. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Conference room B. Down the hall, past the water station. Zarya studied her. Nothing. No flicker. No hint of memory. But Zarya remembered everything. The woman had once looked through her like glass, had called her sweetie when telling her to wait, had smiled at the white male candidate before Zarya's appointment, then told her she was a little early even when she wasn't. Zarya didn't need revenge. She had reality. She walked past the desk, heels clicking against the floor like a metronome for power reclaimed. They passed open office doors, the low hum of productivity buzzing behind them. A few faces glanced up, disinterested. No one stopped her. No one saw her. And still, she had never been more visible. When they reached the conference room, Dana opened the door first. And Zarya froze. It was the room. The same one. The walnut table. The 12 chairs. The place where her voice had once cracked as she tried to hold on to her worth, while a man tossed her resume into the trash. It smelled the same. It looked the same. But she was different. Zarya stepped inside, her body slow, deliberate. She ran her fingers along the back of the chair she had once sat in. The third one from the left. She remembered every second of that humiliation. not because she had been weak, but because it had changed her cells. Now she owned the space. Dana was already unpacking the floor plans and inspection paperwork, oblivious to the tension humming in Zariah's chest. "Want to start with HVAC or foundation?" Dana asked casually. Zariah didn't answer right away. She moved to the head of the table. Grayson's chair. She pulled it back and sat down. It fit differently now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She looked around the room. This wasn't just property. It was a battlefield. And she had won. Dana cleared her throat gently. "Zariah?" Zariah turned her gaze toward the window. The skyline stretched wide beyond the glass, humming with motion and promise. "Start with HVAC," she said finally. "Then we'll check the electrical layouts." Dana nodded, making notes. As she did, Zariah's phone vibrated again. Another message. Another twist. "Incoming meeting request. Grayson Whitmore has scheduled a site visit. ETA 14 minutes. They didn't recognize her, but she remembered every face. Zariah glances at the message, then at the seat she's sitting in. For the first time since this all began, she'll face him again. Not as an applicant, but as the owner of the building he once ruled. And he has no idea who's waiting behind the conference room door. The minute hand on the conference room clock trembled toward the 12. Zariah sat still in the chair. Grayson Whitmore had once claimed as his throne, eyes fixed on the door. The air inside the room was thick with a strange stillness, something between anticipation and reckoning. Her breath was slow even, rehearsed like a heartbeat taught in silence. Dana, still organizing inspection folders, hadn't seen the alert. Zariah hadn't told her. She wanted the moment untouched. It came in less than 14 minutes. The elevator's soft ding was louder than thunder in her ears. Footsteps approached, leather soles striking tile in a tempo. She remembered too well. Then the door opened. Grayson Whitmore entered with the same effortless poise, tailored gray suit, salt and pepper hair parted with mathematical precision, and the slightly arched brow of a man who had learned early that wealth could pass as wisdom. He paused when he saw Dana, nodding in that business-casual way that dismissed and acknowledged all at once. Then his gaze shifted to Zariah. He did not recognize her. His eyes slid past her with only the briefest scan of curiosity, then dropped to the table where the floor plans lay. "I was told the buyers would be in today," he said. "I thought I'd stop by and offer clarity on some of the structural integrations." Zariah didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply said, "That won't be necessary. The clarity's already here." Dana looked up from her notes. "Grayson, this is Zariah Monroe. She's the principal strategist and owner of Cypress Ladder Holdings." Time froze. Whitmore's face didn't react, not at first. There was a flicker, a hesitation, the kind you might expect from a man who has just been told he accidentally handed a crown to the person he once tried to erase. His lips parted slightly. "Zariah Monroe," he repeated, the syllables tasting foreign in his mouth. She tilted her head. "You remember the name?" The silence that followed was cavernous. He blinked, once, then again, and then the truth hit him. Recognition came not in a gasp, not in some performative display, but in the subtle collapse of posture. His shoulders didn't fall, but they faltered. His smile became tighter, calculated. "You," he began, trying to grasp a sentence that wouldn't reveal too much. "You were in this very room," she said calmly, 2 years ago, with a resume you didn't read, with a voice you didn't hear, and with a future you threw in the trash." Dana froze, visibly uncomfortable. Zariah never broke eye contact. Whitmore's throat flexed in a shallow swallow. "That wasn't personal," he said carefully, the tremor in his tone betraying the chill running down his spine. Our firm sees hundreds of pitches a year. Decisions are often unconscious," she finished for him. He winced. "Competitive. Convenient," she corrected. The room sat in a fragile quiet, teetering between apology and denial. Whitmore stepped closer, but not confidently this time. The space between them, once a chasm of power, had inverted. She sat, he stood, but the authority was hers now. "What do you want?" he asked, more softly than she expected. She leaned forward slightly. "I already got what I came for." He looked at the plans again. His building, his anchor project, now hers. "But why not go public?" he asked, confused. "Why use aliases? Shells?" Zariah's eyes narrowed. "Because men like you read faces before resumes. And because the only way to win in a system built to exclude you is to make your moves before they learn you've already arrived." His face stiffened. There it was, the flicker of unease that comes when power realizes it's no longer protected by ignorance. Zaria's attorney entered the room moments later with a file folder in hand. "The deed transfer is complete," she said. "All titles have cleared. You'll find the signatures finalized here. Effective immediately, the Monroe District property cluster, including this building, is now fully owned and operated by Cypress Ladder Holdings." She handed the folder to Zaria, who didn't even glance at it before sliding it into her bag. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but his words tangled somewhere between shock and strategy. In that moment, Zaria would later think, racism lost its mask, and power lost its throne. She rose from the chair slowly, deliberately, then walked to the window. The city lay out beneath her, moving in quiet lines and loud dreams. She pressed a hand against the glass, not to feel it, but to remind herself she no longer had to fight to enter these buildings. Now she owned them. Grayson cleared his throat behind her. "I'll admit, I didn't see this coming."
"That's the difference between us," she replied. "You never looked close enough."
He hesitated. "Then let me say this, Zaria. Miss Monroe." She turned around, arms folded lightly across her chest. He continued, cautious now, calculating. "You clearly have vision, strategy, grit, things I underestimated. But if you're serious about growing this district, about scale, then you'll need capital, institutional support, reach, and I can offer that. My offer is real." She blinked once. "Offer." He nodded, sliding a business card across the table. "Partnership," he said. A beat passed, then another. Zaria looked down at the card without picking it up, and smiled. Not because it amused her, but because this was the final twist. He didn't see her coming. And now, he was asking to follow. In that moment, racism lost its mask, and power lost its throne. Zaria picks up the card slowly. "I'll consider it," she says. But as soon as he leaves the room, her phone buzzes. A journalist from the Atlanta Times has uncovered the identity of Cypress. Zaria stared at the business card like it was dipped in acid. Grayson Whitmore, executive partner. Whitmore Capital Holding. Clean font, crisp edges. The same confidence embedded in every deal he had ever made, that every room could be tilted in his favor, that power would always recognize its own. She held it for a moment longer before slipping it into the side pocket of her leather planner. Not as acceptance, not as curiosity, but as a reminder of how quickly power pivots when it senses its own extinction. As Whitmore exited the conference room, the door clicked shut with a weight far heavier than it should have. Dana was still packing documents, and her attorney reviewed the final closing papers with a red pen. But Zaria tuned them out. Her eyes drifted across the space again. The table, the lighting, the echo of the past reverberating in polished glass and overpriced chairs. She was alone in the room again, but not in the same way. This time she didn't feel invisible. She felt indispensable. And that feeling frightened her more than she expected. Because now that she had claimed what was hers, every inch, every brick, every line of legal proof, she had to face the next truth. She had never been meant to hold this kind of power. Not in their eyes. And now that she did, they'd try to harvest it, repurpose it, hide it inside their structures. Like they always had. Zaria walked out of the building, the Atlanta sun pressing against her skin, the concrete beneath her heels hotter than ever before. But she didn't sweat. She burned from the inside. Not with fear, but with something sharper. Purpose, clarity, fire. She drove in silence. Not to celebrate, not to tell anyone, but to sit in the only place that ever made sense when she needed to think. Her grandmother's bakery. The building was still quiet, but now it belonged to her. Officially, on paper, in soul. She unlocked the side door, walked into the dim light of memory, and sat on the old metal stool near the counter. The same stool her grandmother used to sit on when teaching her how to balance the register. The same one she had once cried beneath after a school teacher accused her of plagiarizing a poem she wrote because it was too eloquent for someone like her. She placed Whitmore's business card on the counter, then stared at it. Black women had always built the foundation, the backbone of business, culture, education, and economics, only to have others take the credit, the ownership, and the control. Her grandmother had told her stories of how banks denied black bakers loans unless a white man co-signed, how hospitals refused to treat her great-aunt when she collapsed from exhaustion after 12-hour shifts, how black mothers were praised for their resilience only when their struggle served someone else's agenda. Even in the modern world, Zaria had watched it happen over and over. Bright, driven black women groomed for leadership, but only offered assistant roles. Ideas stolen in boardrooms, pitched by others, funded without acknowledgement. Grants approved, If someone whiter, safer, more familiar endorsed them first. Whitmore's offer wasn't a compliment. It was colonization, gift wrapped in politeness. He didn't want to build something with her. He wanted to own the part of her he couldn't buy through dismissal. Zarya didn't speak. She took the card, tore it in half, and dropped it in the sink behind the counter. She didn't need a seat at his table. She bought the damn building. Back at her apartment, the city glowed under the dim haze of dusk. She changed into comfortable clothes, pulled her hair into a tight bun, and opened her laptop. For hours, she mapped out the entire block, not as it was, but as it could be. One by one, she opened files, wrote memos, drafted strategy notes. She started with the tenants. The mom-and-pop tax firm on the second floor, rent forgiveness for 3 months, and new signage at no cost. The underused warehouse at the back of the building. She envisioned a tech hub, free co-working space for Black founders who had been shut out of accelerators. The abandoned law office. She contacted a non-profit legal defense group to house their pro bono clinics there. Zarya called a retired architect who had taught her briefly at Harvard and asked for design consultation, paid, not volunteered. Then she reached out to the 3 Black contractors she had met during her property walkthroughs. Not for quotes, for collaboration. "I'm not looking for the lowest bid," she told one of them. "I'm looking for vision rooted in justice." She created job openings. She offered internship slots to nearby high school seniors. She filed a permit for an open-air rooftop gallery, a place to exhibit Black artists, past and present. She renamed the building on all internal documents. The Josephine Monroe Center for Equity and Innovation. Every floor, every corner, redesigned, realigned, reclaimed. Zarya didn't sleep that night. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she had never felt so awake. And then came the twist. An email. No subject line, just a PDF attached. From undisclosed@protonmail.com. She hesitated, scanned the file twice with her security software, then opened it. It was a scanned memo from 2007, City Archives. A redevelopment meeting minutes file between Whitmore Capital Holdings and members of the Atlanta Planning Committee. The contents? A proposal. Outlined, formal, and aggressive. It detailed a strategy to quietly seize Monroe District properties over a 20-year timeline by exploiting zoning loopholes, tax liens, and forced sales through community neglect. The document listed her grandmother's bakery and her grandmother's name. In handwriting next to it, unwilling to sell, wait her out. Zarya's throat dried. This wasn't just business. It was a long, slow erasure. And now she had proof. She printed the file, highlighting it, filed it under a folder titled Receipts. The past wasn't just haunting. It was a confession. She didn't need a seat at their table. She bought the damn building. The next morning, Zarya steps into the building lobby. But something's different. The front wall, the one that held the old tenants directory, has been cleared, replaced with a temporary plaque. It reads, "Under new management, in partnership with Whitmore Capital Holdings." Her face hardens. The ink on the deed hasn't even dried, but someone's already trying to rewrite the narrative. Zarya stood in the lobby, her eyes locked on the sign like it had clawed its way out of the past. Under new management, in partnership with Whitmore Capital Holdings. The words were etched in a slick silver plaque, mounted against the freshly painted wall, as if it had always belonged there. The font was clean, corporate, erasing. But Zarya hadn't approved any signage. She hadn't authorized a single partnership. Her jaw clenched. She pulled out her phone, snapped a photo, and immediately called her building coordinator. "Take that sign down today," she said, voice cold. "If anyone asks who put it up, tell them the legal team is preparing a cease and desist." The woman on the other end stammered. "I thought that was official. Maintenance said it was ordered last night," said someone from Whitmore's group sent. "It's not official. Not by law, not by blood, not by breath," Zarya cut in. "Remove it." She hung up before hearing the reply. It was clear. Whitmore wasn't retreating. He was rebranding, grasping for relevance by associating his name with something he could no longer own. But he'd underestimated something again. Zarya didn't come for attention. She came for transformation. And transformation would happen on her terms. Within a week, the entire building pulsed with change. The lobby, once sterile and echoing, was reimagined with warm oak, hand-painted murals of Black pioneers, and soft seating spaces wrapped in Afrocentric textiles. She replaced the security desk with a community welcome hub, run by 2 local college students majoring in urban development. She renamed the building the Josephine Center. Not a firm, not a foundation, a movement. She gutted the second floor, where soulless cubicles had once drained ambition, and turned it into an open co-working space. No fees for the first 6 months. Priority access for Black-owned startups. Open desks, shared resources, and mentorship circles every Friday. Zaria walked the floor every morning, greeting founders who had been told their pitch decks were too narrow, and artists whose portfolios had been deemed off-brand. Now, they filled the space with code, strategy, laughter, and defiant joy. One woman, a software engineer who had dropped out of a prestigious tech fellowship after being racially harassed, stopped Zaria by the coffee bar. "This is the first space where I don't have to explain my brilliance before using it," she said. Zaria blinked back the weight behind that sentence. "Then you're exactly where you belong," she said. The third floor was converted into classrooms by week 3. Financial literacy, coding boot camps, Black history seminars taught by retired educators. She partnered with local high schools and colleges, offering credits and paid internships. Students from the Monroe district arrived wide-eyed, some in uniforms, others in hoodies and sneakers, unsure if this kind of future was really theirs. One boy approached her with his backpack halfway unzipped. "Are you the lady that owns this?" Zaria nodded. "Depends who's asking." He smiled. "My mom said people like us don't get to run buildings, but I told her I was going to learn how anyway." She knelt beside him. "Then we're learning together." The transformation wasn't loud, but it was radical. Each floor was a blueprint for what cities pretended to support, but rarely did. A reclamation not just of space, but of memory, of worth. And Zaria made sure the message was unmistakable. She hosted a block gathering in the courtyard, inviting the neighborhood, those who had stayed and those who had been pushed out, to see what was now possible. No corporate sponsors, no politicians with empty smiles. Just food, music, and open doors. "I know what this place used to be," she said to the crowd, "and I know what they tried to make it, but now it belongs to the people who built this city from the ground up and were never given the deed." The crowd erupted. The old man from the duplex, Mr. Langston, wiped a tear with the back of his hand. "Your grandmother's watching, baby girl," he whispered, "and she's proud." But with every ripple of progress came resistance. It started with online whispers. Anonymous posts claiming Zaria was excluding others, creating reverse discrimination, pandering to identity politics. Then came the headlines. Manufactured, planted. Black-only spaces spark division in Atlanta's business sector. Who really owns the Josephine Center? Zaria stayed quiet, let the headlines talk. She had learned long ago that silence, when rooted in strategy, could scream louder than outrage. But one morning, as she arrived at the building, she noticed a crowd gathered near the front steps. Protesters. Signs reading "Equity isn't exclusion," and "This is not your land," bobbed above heads. Some held American flags. Others wore red hats. A few chanted in coordinated call and response, their voices sharp with conviction, hollow with ignorance. Her security guard approached nervously. "They've been here for an hour, won't cross the property line, but they're definitely being loud." Zaria scanned the crowd, and then she saw him, Grayson Whitmore, standing across the street, hands clasped behind his back, watching calmly as the crowd swelled. He didn't chant, didn't carry a sign. He just watched. And behind him, a film crew, not local, national. A journalist she recognized from cable news. This wasn't a protest. This was a performance. The narrative was shifting again. Not because it was true, but because someone with enough money had the power to distort it. Zaria didn't step back. She stepped forward. Not toward the protesters, but toward the front door. And as she passed the crowd, she whispered to herself, "This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation." Inside, her assistant hands her a sealed envelope marked "Urgent." Inside is a letter from the city zoning office. An anonymous complaint has been filed to revoke her usage permits due to community disruption. A public hearing is now scheduled. And if she loses, the Josephine Center could be shut down. Scheduled. And if she loses, the Josephine Center could be shut down. The envelope was thin, but it carried the weight of centuries. Zaria's fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single-page letter, crisp and sterile. The header read, "City of Atlanta Zoning Commission." Below that, a formal accusation. Usage of commercial property at 1430 Monroe District is in violation of revised zoning expectations. Public hearing required. But Zaria knew what it really meant. Someone had filed a complaint, not for noise or traffic or code, for disruption. Community disruption. They didn't say her name, but every syllable in the complaint was laced with who she was, and what she represented. A black woman who didn't just own land, they now claimed she was misusing it. She read the letter twice, then folded it quietly. This wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. They never attacked her when she was weak, only when she became powerful. The hearing was scheduled in 10 days. Not enough time to prepare, but more than enough time for the media to do its job. By nightfall, headlines were circling faster than she could answer her phone. City to review controversial community project, led by unlicensed entrepreneur. Josephine Center faces permit reversal, amid allegations of mismanagement. Whitmore responds to allegations. We want what's best for the neighborhood. Zaria sat in her office, the blinds pulled halfway, her inbox swelling with noise. Reporters, investors, pundits wanting statements about racial preference, selective tenancy, and whether she had the background to lead a redevelopment project of this scale. But the worst call came from a city councilwoman she'd once admired. I'm being pressured, the woman confessed, her voice tight. They want to delay your project's next phase, maybe indefinitely. Why? Zaria asked, though she already knew. Because you're not asking for the future anymore. You're building it. Zaria closed her eyes. And that scares them? It terrifies them. She hung up, letting the weight of those words settle into her skin. It wasn't about zoning. It never was. It was about control. About optics. About reminding her that power tolerated her presence but never expected her to own it. And now that she did, they were trying to claw it back. The next morning, protesters returned. Bigger this time. Louder. Television crews joined them, amplifying distorted soundbites clipped from interviews she never gave. One anchor's voice echoed through a live stream. Zaria Monroe, a previously unknown figure in development circles, is now at the center of a firestorm involving zoning rights, racially exclusive access, and community disruption. But even in the noise, something else was rising. Support. People who had remained quiet for too long began to speak. Community leaders, parents, artists, educators, local business owners. They formed a coalition, Friends of the Josephine Center. They flooded the city's website with letters of testimony. They launched social media campaigns. High schoolers from Zariah's literacy program wrote essays about what the building meant to them. A local pastor recorded a sermon titled, Don't Tear Down What You Never Built. Donations poured in for legal fees. The neighborhood held teach-ins on land justice and redlining. A black journalist who had once been shut out of mainstream media published an exposé revealing the racial disparities in Atlanta's zoning violations and how similar white-led projects had never been scrutinized the same way. Zaria didn't ask for the help, but it came anyway. Because the community wasn't defending her. They were defending themselves. Still, she felt the tremor beneath it all. A quiet war being waged in legal offices and backroom meetings. The kind where language wore suits and racism carried pens. Her attorney warned her, You'll need to testify. Zaria nodded. Let them ask their questions. But the attorney leaned in. They're not just going after permits anymore. She slid another envelope across the desk. Subpoena. Zaria read it once, then again. Issued by the Office of the District Commissioner. They wanted her financials, development plans, and records of every tenant agreement signed in the past 90 days. It's a smear attempt, the attorney said. They're trying to build a case around misuse of funds, claiming you're running a political operation under the guise of development. Zaria laughed once, dry and tired. You mean using my own money to build space for people who look like me? Exactly. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. I saw the news, she said, voice steady. Are you safe? Zaria took a breath. I'm not afraid. I know, her mother replied. But make sure you don't confuse fearlessness with being alone. Zaria's voice cracked. I won't. That night she returned to the Josephine Center after hours. No press, no staff. She walked floor to floor, touching every doorframe, every mural, every chair someone had once told her was too expensive, too bold, too black. She stood in the library, where students studied history that had been erased from their textbooks. She paused by the open studio where a father and daughter painted portraits of black joy on canvas scraps they'd salvaged from construction dumpsters. This wasn't a development. It was a declaration. A refusal. A homecoming. When she returned to her office, she found a letter waiting on her desk. No name, no address. Just a single sentence scribbled in blue ink. Power is only ever shared when it's first reclaimed. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but she didn't need to. She folded it, placed it into her journal, and sat at her desk. The subpoena still lay open. its edges sharp and clean. She was being dragged into court, but she was walking in with the community at her back. They never attacked her when she was weak, only when she became powerful. The courthouse date is set, but as her attorney prepares the case, they uncover a deeper threat, a backdoor deal between Whitmore and a city official who may have altered zoning maps months before the Josephine Center was purchased. If proven, Zariah's ownership could be challenged entirely. The courthouse loomed in the distance, like a relic carved from judgment. Thick columns, marble steps, cold symmetry. Zariah stood at the base of it, shoulders squared, breath steady. Her heels struck the steps one by one, every tap a reminder that this wasn't just a hearing, it was history on trial. She stepped through the revolving glass doors and into a space designed to feel intimidating. Security wands, sterile lights, waiting benches filled with bored faces and whispered grievances. But Zariah didn't flinch, not anymore. Courtroom B sat at the end of a corridor lined with portraits of white men in black robes. Men who had decided whose voice mattered and whose didn't for generations. Men whose decisions had stolen land, silenced protests, sanctioned erasure. She was about to speak in the same room where power often pretended neutrality. Inside, the gallery was full. Media, city officials, a scattering of protesters, supporters, opponents, and in the far-right corner, Grayson Whitmore, dressed in a charcoal suit, his fingers steepled over his mouth, watching. He hadn't filed the complaint directly, but his fingerprints were all over it. Zariah's legal team took their seats. Her lead attorney, a brilliant woman named Celeste Hayes, slid a handwritten outline toward her. "Stay with the facts," Celeste whispered, "but don't forget the truth." The judge entered. Black robe, silver hair, years of practiced disinterest stitched into every expression. He opened the docket without ceremony. Case Nub 88210, City of Atlanta v. Cypress Ladder Holdings, Zoning Review and Community Impact Hearing. A city attorney, a white man with sharp eyes and the overconfidence of someone who never doubted his right to be heard, stood first. He painted the Josephine Center as chaotic, disruptive, too activist adjacent. He read from neighborhood complaints, some real, many anonymous, cited permit lines and vague code interpretations, claimed that revitalization efforts must adhere to standards of harmony with existing infrastructure and traditional city values. Zariah's jaw clenched. Traditional city values. She'd heard that before, in boardrooms, on denial letters, in subtle corrections, when she spoke too boldly in meetings. Celeste rose. And for the next 30 minutes, she didn't just defend Zariah. She revealed her aim. She introduced historical maps, showing how Monroe District had been redlined since 1936. She cited the number of properties seized by eminent domain from black families over the past 50 years. She showed demographic data proving that when white-led developers entered black spaces, their projects were fast-tracked, zoning approvals issued in less than half the time. And then, she handed the judge a bound portfolio. Inside were letters from students, tenants, local business owners, pastors, professors, testimonials, proof, people. "This is not a disruption," Celeste said, her voice unwavering. "This is a restoration." The judge barely nodded. "Thank you. Ms. Monroe, you may take the stand." Zariah stood slowly, walked with silence trailing behind her. Once sworn in, she faced the room. Her palms didn't sweat, her throat didn't tremble. She looked straight ahead. And spoke. "I didn't come into Monroe District as a savior. I came home. This community isn't broken. It's been neglected. We didn't cause disruption. We were surviving it." She paused. "The zoning issue you are debating today exists because the lines were never drawn for us to begin with." She looked at the judge. Then, at the court. Then directly at Whitmore. For generations, black entrepreneurs have been locked out of ownership, shut down by red tape designed to silence equity while disguising it as policy. I followed every law, filed every form, paid every tax, and still here I am, defending the right to exist in a space I legally and morally own. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The judge blinked. "Ms. Monroe," he asked, voice measured, "do you claim any partnership with Whitmore Capital Holdings?" "No," Zariah said clearly. "And any claim of partnership was a fabrication to soften my visibility. Their attempt to reframe my success as an extension of their legacy. I removed the signage the moment it appeared." Another pause. The judge leaned back. "Do you have anything else to add?" Zariah took a breath, then offered the final line that had haunted her for weeks. "Even in court, black excellence is treated like rebellion." The room went still. No objection. No outburst. Just silence. Because everyone in that room felt the truth, whether they admitted it or not. The judge called a 10-minute recess. Zariah returned to her seat. Celeste squeezed her hand. You did more than testify. You reminded them why they're afraid. Whitmore didn't look at her. He stared ahead, his leg twitching once beneath the table. Outside, activists gathered. The street was lined with supporters holding signs. Black space is sacred space. Our history is not a violation. We stand with Zariah. In the distance, news vans hummed. Cameras focused. Inside, the judge returned. Everyone stood. Zariah didn't blink. She looked him in the eye. And waited. Even in court, black excellence is treated like rebellion. The judge clears his throat, looks over the papers and finally begins. In consideration of the evidence presented. In consideration of the evidence presented. The courtroom inhaled as one, suspended in collective stillness. This court finds no legal violation in the zoning operations conducted by Cypress Ladder Holdings. The words fell like a thunderclap behind Zariah's ribs. The judge continued, voice neutral but clear. Furthermore, we find that any perceived disruptions were unfounded and stemmed more from community adjustment to inclusive development than from actual breaches of ordinance. Whitmore's jaw tensed. His eyes remained locked forward, unblinking, unreadable. But his empire, for the first time, looked small, shrinking in real time. Zariah remained still, her fingers resting on the edge of the bench. Not because she didn't want to cry, but because victory, when earned through years of being silenced, tastes different. It doesn't explode. It hums, like the vibration of a truth finally released. Celeste placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. We just changed the blueprint. The judge adjourned the hearing. And Zariah walked out of that courthouse not as a headline or an exception, but as a force that refused to be folded into silence. That same evening, she returned to the Josephine Center just before midnight. Everyone else had gone home, but the building, now legally hers without challenge, pulsed with energy, like it had been holding its breath all along. She didn't go to her office. She climbed the stairwell, floor by floor, until she reached the rooftop. The Atlanta skyline stretched out like a soft breath against the stars. In her bag were 3 paintbrushes, a roll of stencils, and 7 small cans of color. She began with the west-facing wall, a blank stretch of brick left intentionally untouched during renovations. Her first stroke was quiet, yellow, then red, then black. By sunrise, she had finished the outline of a black woman in silhouette, arms raised not in surrender, but in architecture, fingers sculpting a city out of clay. Over the next week, Zariah invited artists, students, and elders to fill the center's walls with history. They painted Ella Baker beside Trayvon Martin, Angela Davis beside George Floyd. They covered sterile drywall with powerful portraits, dignified, defiant, smiling through centuries of resistance. In the children's library, they painted a tree whose roots wrapped around names lost to violence, and whose branches bloomed with living legacies. On the front entrance, Zariah herself painted the final piece. It was her grandmother, Josephine, standing barefoot in her old bakery apron, holding a tray of bread in one hand and a deed in the other. Behind her, the skyline was cracked open, sunlight pouring through. When she stepped back, the building no longer looked like real estate. It looked like a revolution. Journalists began calling again, but this time, not with accusations, with curiosity. They wanted the full story. Who was she? Where did she come from? How did she, someone with no political ties, no major investors, no legacy advantage, build something so defiantly whole in the face of every fracture? Her assistant handed her a manila envelope at the front desk. This one's from the Atlanta Times. They want an exclusive. Inside was a letter. Formal. But beneath the professional tone, something else. We believe the public deserves to hear what the zoning hearing never could. How a woman rewrote a city's map without asking for permission. Zariah didn't answer right away. She stood in the courtyard, beneath the mural of her grandmother, and watched a group of young girls walking into the center with laptops in their backpacks. One of them looked up, eyes wide. Are you the one who built this? Zariah smiled. We all did. She watched them disappear into the building. And for the first time since that resume hit the trash, she realized something simple but seismic. She hadn't just survived the system. She had rewritten the code. She turned a building of exclusion into a monument of resistance. That afternoon, a call comes in, not from the local paper, but from a national news network. They want to fly her out, not just for an interview, but for a televised town hall titled Power, Property, and the New Black South. The request came on official letterhead, gold embossed with a national media network's logo. Power, Property, and the New Black South, live town hall discussion. They wanted Zariah to sit center stage. Not behind a closed-door panel, not buried in a blog post. Live, televised, prime time. At first she laughed, soft and disbelieving. The kind of laughter that bubbles from shock, not joy. 2 years ago, her name hadn't made it past a receptionist's glance. Now it was on news tickers, conference invites, and think tank whiteboards. Professors wrote articles about her. Urban developers quoted her in debates. A segment aired on national television, calling her the unexpected voice reshaping Atlanta. And yet the phrase that stuck in her mind wasn't voice. It was unexpected. She sat alone in her apartment one evening, the lights low, city noise muffled beyond her window. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, text from organizers, press liaisons, community leaders, friends she hadn't heard from since grad school. But she didn't answer. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same vision board she'd tacked up 3 years ago. Half the images were faded, the words "Own the Block" still bold in Sharpie. But she felt distant. Not from the mission, from the space around her. The paradox of visibility. They see you, but they don't know you. She thought of the nights she cried into a pillow, because her voice cracked during that pitch. The days she skipped lunch just to afford ink for resumes that no one would read. The times she walked into rooms and smiled, knowing she was being measured before she even spoke. Now those same rooms opened for her. But none of them asked what it cost. The interviews were polished, the applause was loud. But none of them captured what it felt like to succeed alone. Because that's what no one warned her about, that the higher she climbed, the fewer hands reached out to steady her. Black excellence, she realized, was often treated like a miracle instead of a blueprint. Like it wasn't meant to exist in plain sight. A producer called her later that week. "We're going to center you in the discussion," he said enthusiastically. "We think it's time to highlight someone who didn't just fight back, but changed the rules." Zariah listened quietly. Then asked, "And when I changed them, did they like the new version?" The silence on the line said enough. Because while the world cheered her now, she knew how quickly celebration became surveillance. How quickly praise curdled into critique. Still, she agreed to the town hall. Because her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was for every woman who had been dismissed, erased, talked over, asked to soften her voice to be heard. It was for the students who entered the Josephine Center and whispered, "I didn't know places like this were for us." It was for her grandmother. The night before the event, she walked the halls of the center alone. Her heels echoed off murals now dried and sealed, the paint still faintly fragrant. She touched the portrait of Josephine one more time. "I didn't beat the system," she whispered. "I exposed it." The next morning, her face was on screens across the country. She wore a black suit, no jewelry, and a pin shaped like a key, her grandmother's key on her lapel. The questions were pointed, some sympathetic, others masked in critique. A moderator asked, "Do you worry about being seen as too political?" Zariah looked into the camera. "I worry about being told that equity is a threat," she replied. "I worry that justice only feels loud when it's no longer ignorable." Applause rippled through the audience. After the town hall ended, a line formed behind the stage. Media executives, activists, black teenagers holding notebooks, elders thanking her with tears. She smiled, nodded, hugged, signed a few books someone had printed with her quotes. But her mind was already drifting. She missed quiet. And then, near the end of the crowd, a tall man in a navy suit stepped forward. Distinguished, clean-shaven. Maybe in his early 50s. His voice was smooth. "Miss Monroe, I've been following your work very closely. I represent a coalition of private equity firms with a shared interest in conscious development." She narrowed her eyes, the smile fading slightly. "We're not Whitmore," he added quickly. "Quite the opposite. We're interested in investing in people who already know how to lead. We don't need to mentor you. We want to fund you." Zariah raised a brow. "You're late." He chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe we just needed to see what you'd do with your first win. Now we'd like to help you scale it, nationally." He handed her a folder. Initial capital pledge, $15 million. Zariah stared at the number, her fingers trembling slightly. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was weight. Because the offer was real. And it could change everything. She didn't beat the system. She exposed it. She opens the folder later that night and flips to the second page. Her eyes freeze. Listed among the investors, a subsidiary tied to Whitmore Capital, a ghost dressed as a partner. The ink was still drying when Zariah closed the folder. On the second page of the proposal, nestled between harmless legal language and projected returns, it sat like a shadow in daylight, backed in part by Rowan Holdings Group, a strategic partner of Whitmore Capital. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She simply folded the document, placed it in her fireplace, and lit a match. Let it burn. Because legacy wasn't built with borrowed money from ghosts who wore masks of progress. It was built with memory, with roots, with soil tilled by the hands of those denied everything but still planted seeds. And Zariah had learned long ago, some partnerships came not to uplift, but to dilute. So instead, she built her own. She launched the Josephine Equity Fund the following spring, a grassroots investment platform, backed not by venture capitalists, but by the very community that had poured into her teachers, barbers, single mothers, retired nurses, and first-gen college grads. The fund wasn't flashy, but it was fierce. It provided microloans and mentorship to young black women launching businesses across the South. No pitch contests, no suits, just vision and a willingness to build. Zariah visited every applicant's neighborhood before awarding a single dollar. She wanted to see not just the plan, but the soil it would grow in. She remembered what it meant to feel invisible. So she built a system that saw people first. Each month, she returned to the Josephine Center to teach workshops, contracts, zoning, negotiation, self-worth. Sometimes 5 women showed up, sometimes 50. She paid every speaker, fed every participant, and never once asked for gratitude. Because this wasn't charity. It was blueprint. She bought 3 more buildings over the next 2 years, one in Jackson, Mississippi, another in Charlotte, one more in Tulsa, blocks away from where Black Wall Street once thrived. She didn't brand them with her name. She branded them with her values. Each space had a mural of a black woman, not famous but foundational, a seamstress, a midwife, a teacher, a matriarch. The final plaque in every entryway read, "This is what happens when you plant where others paved over." Despite her growing platform, Zariah remained grounded. She turned down TV deals, declined memoir offers. She never joined the city planning committee, though she was invited twice. She didn't want a seat at that table. She'd already built one that fed people. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between deadlines and dawn, she still thought about the moment her resume had hit that trash bin. The cold plastic echo. The way Whitmore hadn't even looked at her name. And she realized, they weren't afraid of her ideas. They were afraid of what her ideas proved. That genius doesn't always wear their skin. That leadership doesn't sound like them. That power doesn't ask, it arrives. Zariah stood in front of a classroom of teenage girls one Saturday afternoon, holding up her old Harvard diploma and a scorched piece of paper, one of the last resumes she'd deleted the night everything changed. "You'll be told to shrink," she said, "to soften, to make your brilliance easier to swallow." The girls leaned in. She held up the diploma. "This tells the world I earned their respect." Then she held up the burned page. "This tells the world I didn't need it." They clapped. Some cried. But Zariah didn't cry anymore. Her tears had long ago turned to ink and policy, and brick and blueprint. One morning, years later, she stood at the entrance of the Josephine Center once again. She was older now, softer in some places, stronger in others. The building stood taller than ever, but it wasn't for her anymore. A young woman walked beside her, confidence, wide-eyed, wearing a blazer Zariah had once worn to her first public speaking event, her daughter, Kamari Elise Monroe. The lobby had changed slightly. More screens, updated glass, but the mural of Josephine still greeted every visitor. Zariah walked her to the elevator. "You ready?" she asked. Kamari nodded, her voice calm. "More than you were," she said playfully. Zariah laughed, wiping the corner of her eye. And when the doors opened, Kamari stepped in, not as a visitor, not as a hopeful intern, but as CEO. The title wasn't inherited. She'd earned it. Through years of shadowing, service, and building under her mother's gaze, but never in it. Zariah didn't say goodbye. She simply whispered, "Make it bigger," and watched as the elevator closed. Outside, the city was alive. But inside that building, born from erasure, raised through fire, and now led by legacy, something eternal pulsed beneath the paint. A memory, a lesson, a quiet revolution still unfolding. The resume they threw away became the blueprint for a revolution. As Kamari steps into the top-floor office, she finds an envelope on her new desk, handwritten, sealed in wax. Inside, a note from her mother. Don't build what I built. Build what I couldn't. If this story moved you, if Zara's journey made you reflect, question, or dream a little bigger, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that silence can be shattered, that erasure can be rewritten, and that legacy is not given, it's built. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that center truth, justice, and the Black experience, because the stories they try to bury, we dig up, we honor, and we amplify. And if you believe in this mission, like this video. Your support turns storytelling into resistance.